The emergency call came through at 11:47 p.m. A security guard at a chemical processing facility on the city's industrial perimeter reported hearing sounds consistent with gunfire inside the main production building. The caller was positioned in the exterior guardhouse and had no visual on the interior. He confirmed that the overnight shift was currently on site. Approximately 32 employees working across 3 buildings in the facility complex. The plant processed industrial solvents and chemical compounds used in manufacturing. It operated 24 hours with reduced staffing during night shifts. Security protocols were standard for facilities handling hazardous materials. Controlled access points. Surveillance cameras covering key areas. Emergency response procedures for chemical spills or equipment failures. The facility had never experienced a security incident beyond minor vandalism and theft attempts. There was no history of workplace violence, no labor disputes, no threats against the company or its employees. The call reporting possible gunfire was unprecedented. Local police responded first. 2 patrol units arrived at 11:54 p.m. and established contact with the security guard. He reported that surveillance feeds from inside the main production building had gone dark approximately 10 minutes before he heard the sounds. No communication from the overnight shift supervisor. No response to radio calls. The exterior of the facility appeared normal. No visible signs of forced entry. No vehicles in the parking lot beyond those belonging to the night shift employees. Officers established a perimeter and requested additional units. The decision was made to treat this as an active threat situation. SWAT was activated at 12:03 a.m. The initial assessment suggested a possible workplace violence scenario or an industrial accident that had disabled communications. The tactical team staged at a warehouse facility 4 blocks from the chemical plant. The briefing was complicated by limited intelligence. 32 employees confirmed on site based on shift logs. Unknown number of potential threats. Unknown nature of the incident. The facility layout included 3 main buildings connected by covered walkways. The largest structure housed the primary production equipment and processing lines. The tactical plan prioritized 2 objectives: establish contact with anyone inside the facility and determine the nature and scope of the threat. Entry would be made through the administrative wing, which was separated from the active production areas by fire doors and safety barriers designed to contain chemical incidents. At 12:31 a.m., the SWAT element moved into position. 18 operators divided into 3 teams. Thermal imaging from outside showed heat signatures consistent with human presence in the main production building, but the industrial equipment created interference that made accurate counts impossible. The building's thick walls and chemical shielding further limited external surveillance capabilities. The entry was methodical. Front administrative doors breached at 12:38 a.m. The interior was lit but empty. Offices were unoccupied. Computer terminals were active, showing production monitoring systems still running. No signs of struggle. No visible damage. The first team moved through the administrative section toward the fire doors that separated the offices from the production floor. The doors were closed but not locked. Standard procedure during normal operations. When operators opened the doors and entered the production area, they encountered an environment unlike any tactical space most had worked in before. The production floor was vast. 40-foot ceilings supported massive ventilation systems. Chemical processing equipment lined the walls. Pipes ran overhead carrying various compounds between storage tanks and reaction chambers. The air had a sharp chemical smell that was immediately noticeable even through respiratory protection. This wasn't a standard building. It was an industrial environment where every surface, every piece of equipment, and every structural element existed to support chemical processing operations. The floor was empty of personnel. Equipment was running. Processing systems were active. But nobody was visible in the main production space. Operators moved through the area, clearing sight lines and checking behind equipment clusters. The thermal signatures detected from outside should have corresponded to people in this area, but the space was deserted. Then an operator noticed the floor access panel. Industrial facilities often have underground utility spaces for pipes, electrical systems, and equipment that can't be exposed to production floor conditions. These spaces are typically crawl spaces or narrow service corridors. The floor panel that caught the operator's attention was larger, 4 feet by 6 feet, heavy steel construction with recessed handles, the kind of panel that provides access to something more substantial than utility lines. The panel was closed but not secured. It lifted easily when 2 operators pulled on the handles. Beneath it was a steel ladder descending into darkness. The space below wasn't a utility crawl space. It was a full-height corridor approximately 8 feet below the production floor. This was a bunker, a reinforced underground structure that didn't appear on any of the building plans provided by the facility management. Its existence wasn't documented in the emergency response information that had been given to the tactical teams during the briefing. An operator descended the ladder with weapon-mounted light cutting through the darkness. The corridor extended in both directions. Concrete walls, steel reinforcement visible in the ceiling structure. This wasn't a recent addition. This was a permanent installation built when the facility was constructed, possibly decades earlier. The corridor to the left terminated at a locked door after approximately 30 feet. The corridor to the right extended further before branching into multiple passages. The operator signaled for additional team members and began moving toward the locked door. Before they reached it, a voice came from behind the door. Male. Calm. Speaking clearly enough to be understood through the steel barrier. Stop where you are. I can see you. If you try to open this door, I will detonate the charges. The operator froze. Training kicked in immediately. When someone claims to have explosives, you don't test that claim until you have more information. The operator backed away from the door slowly, maintaining visual contact with the barrier while updating the team leader on the surface. Negotiators were requested. Bomb technicians were activated. The situation had just escalated from a possible workplace violence incident to a confirmed hostage situation with explosives in an underground bunker beneath a chemical processing facility. The voice behind the door spoke again. I have 28 people down here. All of them are from the night shift. All of them are rigged with explosive devices. I also have charges placed throughout this bunker and on critical equipment in the production facility above us. If you attempt entry, if you cut power to this building, if you try to interfere with my communications, I will detonate everything. The tactical teams withdrew to the production floor. A perimeter was established around the floor access panel. Negotiators arrived on scene at 1:14 a.m. Communication was established through the bunker door using a megaphone system since the individual inside refused to use phone or radio. The negotiator identified herself, asked for confirmation that everyone inside was safe, requested to speak with one of the hostages. The response was measured and disturbingly rational. Everyone is alive. Nobody is injured. But everyone is on a timer. I have demands that will be met, or this facility becomes a crater. You have 90 minutes to decide if you want to take this seriously. 90 minutes! The time was now 1:22 a.m. That put the deadline at 2:52 a.m. Less than an hour and a half to resolve a hostage situation involving explosives in an underground bunker beneath a chemical plant where a detonation could trigger secondary explosions and release toxic materials. The facility was immediately evacuated. All personnel who had been working in the other buildings were moved to a safe distance. Nearby residential areas were quietly notified to shelter in place. Hazmat teams were positioned around the perimeter. The fire department staged equipment for chemical incident response. The situation was now a multi-agency emergency response with federal involvement due to the nature of the facility and the potential for mass casualty if the threat was executed. Negotiators worked to establish dialogue. The individual inside the bunker was calm, articulate, and focused. He claimed to be a former employee who had been wrongfully terminated 3 years earlier. He claimed the company had engaged in illegal disposal of hazardous materials that had contaminated local groundwater. He claimed regulatory agencies had been bribed or misled to ignore violations. And he claimed that the only way to force accountability was to create a crisis that couldn't be ignored. His demands were specific: public admission from company executives about illegal practices, commitment to environmental remediation funded by the company, legal protections for whistleblowers, and media coverage to ensure the information reached the public. If these demands were met within 90 minutes, he would surrender peacefully and deactivate the explosives. If they were not met, he would detonate the charges and accept whatever consequences resulted. Company executives were located and brought to a command post. They denied all allegations. They insisted the facility operated within regulatory compliance. They claimed the individual making threats was a disgruntled former employee who had been terminated for legitimate performance issues. They refused to make any public statements that could be interpreted as admissions of wrongdoing. The clock continued running. At 1:47 a.m., the deadline was 65 minutes away. Bomb technicians used fiber optic cameras to examine the bunker door and surrounding areas. They confirmed the presence of explosive charges wired to the door frame. Attempting to force entry would almost certainly trigger detonation. The charges appeared to be professionally constructed. This wasn't an amateur making empty threats. Additional cameras were deployed through ventilation gaps and utility conduits. The bunker interior became partially visible. The space was larger than initial estimates suggested. Multiple rooms branching off the main corridor. In one visible room, operators could see people sitting on the floor. They appeared calm, no visible injuries. But each person had what looked like an explosive device attached to their chest with heavy strapping. The devices were crude but functional. Plastic explosive blocks connected to electronic detonators. The detonators were wired to a central control system that the individual inside could trigger remotely. If the charges detonated, everyone in that room would die instantly. The explosion would also likely compromise the bunker's structural integrity and could trigger secondary detonations in the production facility above. Negotiators continued dialogue. The individual inside provided evidence supporting his claims about environmental violations. Photos, documents, test results showing contamination levels that exceeded legal limits. The information appeared credible. Whether it was sufficient to prove systematic wrongdoing was unclear, but it wasn't the fabrication of someone detached from reality. At 2:03 a.m., 49 minutes remained. Company executives were under intense pressure to respond to the demands. Legal counsel advised against any statements that could be interpreted as admissions of liability. Corporate communications teams argued that making concessions under threat would set a dangerous precedent. Plant management insisted the allegations were false and that meeting the demands would legitimize terrorism. The tactical teams developed contingency plans for emergency entry. If the deadline passed and detonation appeared imminent, operators would have seconds to breach the bunker, neutralize the threat, and begin extracting hostages. The probability of success was estimated at less than 30%. The probability of mass casualties was over 70%. It was a plan of absolute last resort. At 2:19 a.m., 33 minutes remained. Federal negotiators took over communication. They had more flexibility to make representations about investigations and legal proceedings. They could promise that allegations would be thoroughly examined. They could commit to regulatory review of the facility's operations. They could offer legal protections for providing information about environmental violations. What they couldn't do was force company executives to make public admissions or guarantee specific outcomes. The individual inside the bunker understood this. He knew his demands were unlikely to be fully met. But he had invested 3 years planning this operation, and he believed the public attention created by the crisis would force accountability, even if his specific demands weren't satisfied. At 2:31 a.m., 21 minutes remained. The individual announced he would release 10 hostages as a sign of good faith if federal agencies committed to investigating the environmental allegations. Negotiators agreed immediately. 10 minutes later, a section of the bunker door unlocked. 10 people emerged, moving quickly up the ladder to the production floor. They were escorted out of the facility and immediately debriefed. Their accounts were consistent. The individual inside had been waiting when they arrived for the night shift. He had used a stolen access card to enter the facility and had spent hours preparing the bunker before they showed up. He forced them down into the space at gunpoint, secured them with the explosive devices, and explained his intentions. He had been calm throughout. No violence beyond the threat itself. He repeatedly emphasized that he didn't want anyone to die, but that he was prepared to follow through if necessary. 18 people remained in the bunker. The individual inside announced that the deadline still applied. At 2:52 a.m., if his demands were not met, he would detonate the charges. The release of 10 hostages was intended to demonstrate his seriousness and his willingness to show restraint if progress was being made. At 2:41 a.m., 11 minutes remained. Company executives agreed to release a statement acknowledging concerns had been raised about environmental practices and committing to cooperate with any regulatory investigations. It wasn't the full admission the individual had demanded, but it was more than the company had been willing to offer an hour earlier. The statement was read to him through the megaphone system. His response was silence for almost 2 minutes. Then he spoke again. "That's not enough. You're giving me corporate language that means nothing. I need real accountability." At 2:47 a.m., 5 minutes remained. Federal negotiators made a final offer. Immediate investigation by the Environmental Protection Agency with public reporting of findings. Criminal referral for any violations discovered. Whistleblower protections under federal law. Media access to all public information generated by the investigation, and a commitment that the individual would face charges only for the hostage-taking itself, not for any other allegations related to reporting environmental violations. The individual inside went silent. The clock continued counting down. Tactical teams prepared for emergency breach. Bomb technicians positioned equipment to attempt detonation disruption if they had any warning before the charges were triggered. At 2:51 a.m., 1 minute remained. The bunker door opened. The individual stepped out with his hands raised. He was unarmed. He announced that the hostages were secured but that the detonation system was still active. He walked slowly to the ladder and began climbing. When he reached the production floor, operators took him into custody. He provided the deactivation code for the explosive devices. Bomb technicians entered the bunker and began the careful process of rendering the charges safe. It took 47 minutes to fully clear the bunker and remove the devices from the remaining 18 hostages. Every charge was functional. Every detonator was properly wired. If he had triggered the system, the explosion would have killed everyone in the bunker and potentially caused catastrophic damage to the facility above. The hostages were evacuated and provided with medical and psychological support. None were physically injured. All were severely traumatized by spending hours rigged with explosives while listening to negotiations that would determine whether they lived or died. The individual was charged with federal terrorism offenses, hostage-taking, possession of explosive devices, and multiple other counts. During interrogation, he provided detailed information about his allegations against the company. Federal investigators began examining the claims. Within 3 months, preliminary findings confirmed elevated contamination levels in groundwater near the facility. Within 6 months, the company was facing significant fines and mandatory remediation orders. The environmental violations were real. The illegal disposal practices had occurred. The company had failed to report the problems and had taken steps to conceal the contamination. The individual's methods were criminal, but his allegations were substantiated. For the tactical teams, the operation remained a reference point about situations where tactical solutions are limited by circumstances. The bunker environment, the explosive devices, the chemical facility location, All of these factors reduced the viability of forced entry and increased reliance on negotiation. The timeline was the critical element. 90 minutes from threat announcement to deadline. That window allowed negotiators to make progress, allowed tactical teams to develop contingency plans, and allowed the individual inside to recognize that some movement was occurring on his demands. If the deadline had been 30 minutes, there wouldn't have been time for productive negotiation. If it had been 6 hours, the individual might have had time to second-guess himself or panic. 90 minutes was long enough to attempt resolution, but short enough to maintain urgency. The decision to release 10 hostages changed the dynamic. It demonstrated that the individual was acting rationally and was willing to show restraint. It reduced the number of people at risk, and it provided operators with direct testimony about conditions inside the bunker and the state of mind of the person holding them. The final surrender came 59 seconds before the stated deadline. Whether he would have actually detonated the charges if the deadline passed remains unknown. His attorneys argued he never intended to harm anyone and that the entire operation was designed to force attention to legitimate environmental concerns. Prosecutors argued he had created a genuine threat that endangered 28 people and could have caused mass casualties. The trial lasted 8 weeks. The evidence of explosive charges, the testimony of hostages, and recordings of the negotiations left no doubt about the facts. The jury convicted on all major counts. Sentencing included decades in federal prison with recommendations that he serve substantial time before any consideration of release. The company faced separate legal action: civil suits from affected community members, criminal charges for environmental violations, regulatory fines that reached tens of millions of dollars. The facility was eventually shut down permanently, and the site entered a long-term remediation process. The bunker was filled with concrete. The underground structure that had existed beneath the production floor for decades was permanently sealed. The investigation revealed it had been built during an earlier era when facilities handling hazardous materials routinely included hardened shelters for protection against industrial accidents or civil defense scenarios. It had been largely forgotten until someone who had worked at the facility remembered its existence and saw an opportunity to use it. For the 28 people who spent hours sitting in that bunker with explosive devices strapped to their bodies, recovery was a long process. Some returned to work in different industries. Others struggled with trauma that prevented them from functioning in enclosed spaces or high-stress environments. Support services were provided, but the psychological impact of knowing you could be killed at any moment by someone else's decision is difficult to overcome. The tactical operation succeeded without casualties. The hostages were released. The explosive threat was neutralized. The facility was secured. But the success came through negotiation rather than force, through timing rather than tactical superiority, and through an outcome that remained uncertain until the final seconds before the deadline expired. The call that came in at 11:47 p.m. reporting possible gunfire inside a chemical plant became a 90-minute crisis that exposed environmental crimes, endangered 28 people, and forced a confrontation between tactical response capabilities and the limitations imposed by explosives, confinement, and time pressure. The bunker existed beneath the production floor. The hostages were rigged with charges. The deadline was absolute, and the resolution came 59 seconds before the timer reached 0.